The highly successful investor Ray Dalio attributes his success to how he made a detailed study of history to understand how the world works, and specifically the cycles of how world powers rise and fall and why such cycles become inevitable based on people following the choices and incentives that are in front of them. He pointed out that the key to surviving and hopefully thriving in your own little slice of history is to at least have some insight into the forces that are at play and how the dynamics are likely to lead them. Because you can do well in good times, you can do well in bad times, so long as you understand where you are and what is likely to happen next. He wrote about all of this in his book, How Nations Succeed and Fail, and it provides some fascinating insights, so let's have a look. People tend to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. In other words, the exact same things don't happen in identical fashion, but the broadly comparable dynamics play through events nonetheless. As an investor, Ray Dalio became interested in understanding the past better when some developments came along that he simply hadn't seen before in his lifetime, but he quickly realised had happened numerous times before in history. What he saw, for instance, was the confluence of huge debts and zero or near zero interest rates. That led to the massive printing of money in the world's three major reserve currencies. It led to big political and social conflicts within countries, particularly the US, due to the largest wealth, political and values gaps in a century, and the rising of a new world power in the form of China to challenge the existing order. He decided to study what had happened in the past to see what was comparable, what, if anything, was unique to this current time, what was fixed, what might be changeable, and to use that to inform his strategies as an investor first and foremost, but obviously such understanding is helpful whatever you do. And this led him to the realization that all the empires and dynasties through history go in relatively well-defined life cycles. To an extent, all nations do, in fact. The big cycles produce swings between peaceful and prosperous times of great innovation and productivity that raise living standards. These periods could last quite a long time. And then shorter periods of fighting, the destruction of wealth and other things. And those periods were necessary interruptions, transition periods, before any sort of productive phase would be able to start again. They got rid of weaknesses and excesses such as too much debt, too much decadence, and they pushed people to return to fundamentals on a sounder footing. It's kind of a painful process, as you might imagine, one often expressed through major conflicts, internal and or external. And that, says Dalio, leads to the next world order. After the conflict is resolved, it is clear who has what power. And because most people desperately want peace, there is a resolution that produces new monetary, economic and political systems, together a new world order, and fosters the next peaceful/creative period. Within this long-term cycle, he says there are other cycles. There are long-term debt cycles that last about 100 years, short-term cycles with expansion and contraction elements. In other words, this is all normal. What we're seeing today, what we may think to be extraordinary, is the latest version of what has happened numerous times before. It may not be pleasant, but the swinging of conditions from one extreme to the other is the norm, not the exception. We don't generally realise it because the length of that big cycle is longer than a human lifetime. So we see changes as unique to our experience without really realising that they followed this pattern over and over. And this is particularly relevant if you live in one of those great powerful empires where your currency is the reserve currency of the world. A reserve currency is a currency that is accepted around the world for transactions and savings. Dalio says this: throughout my life, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency. monetary policy has been an effective tool for stimulating economies, and democracy and capitalism have been widely regarded as the superior political and economic systems. Anyone who studies history can see that no system of government, no economic system, no currency and no empire lasts forever, yet almost everyone is surprised and ruined when they fail. These changes don't happen by chance, he points out. They happen because of a progression of cause and effect relationships. The big thing affecting people in most countries through history is the struggle to make, take and distribute wealth and power, notwithstanding complicating factors of ideology and religion at certain points. The people who get the most wealth are those who own the things that create the wealth, and they collaborate with those who hold political power. Over time, this leads to a very small percentage of the population gaining exceptionally large amounts of the total wealth and power, who then become overextended and encounter bad times. Now, those bad times hit the least wealthy and powerful the hardest, and that leads to conflict, which produces revolutions and or civil wars. Those conflicts lead to the new order, and so the cycle begins. Now, we're not helpless in the face of all this. How you manage the economy matters. Dalio puts it this way: countries with large savings, low debts, and a strong reserve currency can withstand economic and credit collapses better than countries that don't have much savings, have a lot of debt, and don't have a strong reserve currency. Likewise, those that have strong and capable leadership and civil populations, imagine what that would be like, can be managed better than those that don't have these, and those that are more inventive will adapt better than those that are less inventive. Throughout history, the dominant groups, whether kingdoms, countries or empires, have risen to become the world's leading powers and used that position to determine the world order. When they lost that power, which they all did, the world order changed in major ways. This graph shows the relative standing of those empires over the last 500 years, the fall of previous dominant China, the rise and fall of the Netherlands, its replacement by the United Kingdom, the British Empire, and then the decline of that through the 2 world wars and the dominance of the United States. And there's the US in full decline, even as China now re-emerges with rapid climb towards prime position. So why do these dominant countries rise? What do they have that others don't have? And why do the formerly dominant ones decline? Could you do anything about that? Why can't they just keep doing what they did to rise in the first place and stay on top forever? Well, the rise, according to Dalio's research, comes from 8 determinants. They are 1. High-quality education, which feeds 2. Growing competitiveness, and 3. Innovation, leading to 4. Economic output, 5. Growing share of world trade. Add to that 6. Military strength, 7. Financial centres strength, and finally 8. As a consequence of all of that, gaining and holding reserve currency status. And they come in roughly that order because the education and the competitiveness creates the circumstances for the others to develop. Similarly, the reserve currency status lags the cycle, declining only gradually at first until some trigger leads it to drop suddenly and more rapidly. As for the cycle of emergence and decline, the big cycle, this happens in 3 phases. The rise comes because of those determinants and because the country is fundamentally strong. To be fundamentally strong, you have to have relatively low levels of indebtedness, relatively small gaps between people in terms of wealth, in terms of their values, their political beliefs. And that leads to people working effectively together to produce prosperity, good education and infrastructure, strong and capable leadership, and a peaceful world order that enables all of those things to thrive. That then takes you to the second stage, when you hit your very peak. But the rewards of success bring the seeds of eventual failure. So, for instance, wages rise, making workers less globally competitive, and they tend to work less hard so that they can enjoy some of that hard-won leisure. Once that happens, you start to see more excesses, growing levels of indebtedness, growing gaps in wealth values and political perspectives within that society, declining education and infrastructure, growing internal conflicts and struggles between countries as overextended empires start to get challenged by new and emerging rivals. And then you get to the decline. Debts have become very large, and when there's an economic downturn, the empire can't anymore borrow money to pay its debts, so it generally prints lots of new money, devaluing its currency and raising inflation. The impact on all of this on the less well-off majority feeds political extremism, populism of the left or populism of the right, or both. Elites are blamed for problems leading to conflict. A period of destruction needed to wipe the slate clean for a new period of building. And of course, none of that goes unnoticed elsewhere. So as the great powers become weakened by their internal division and indebtedness, outside challengers will gradually take advantage. Those challenges will get bolder and bolder until the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome, but retreating effectively cedes power to the challenger. Now that's the traditional equation. It can be expected to play out in modified form between powers whose military strength could inflict unacceptable damage on the other, as is now the case in the modern world with nuclear weapons and the growing level of other weapons of mass destruction. And in that situation, conflicts may come in the form of proxy wars, and you should watch whether the older power's allies start to peel off and join forces with the emerging power, or just drift into studied neutrality. This has already started to happen to the US to some degree. Dalio says this: as the Chinese know very well, and it would be good for others to keep in mind, the best way to fight a war is to get strong and show one's opponent one's strength so they don't want to fight violently. From all of that decline, it's the loss of reserve currency status that is the final blow. And Dalio says this: when those holding the reserve currency and debt of a declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. The US is currently able to bear its huge indebtedness because of that privileged reserve currency status. It can print more dollars, and the rest of the world wants those dollars. If it loses that status, it will be in an extremely deep and dark hole. And that's inevitable, Dalio says, because when you look back through history, it happens over and over again. So he observes when the Dutch Empire gave way to the British Empire, and when the British Empire gave way to the American equivalent, most of the following things happened: debt restructuring and debt crisis, internal revolution, peaceful or violent, that leads to large transfers of wealth from the haves to the have-nots, external war, big currency breakdown, and new domestic and world order. 75 years on from the last of those transitions around the two world wars, the major old empires, the US, but also many countries in the West, certainly the UK included, are demonstrably approaching the end of that long-term debt cycle. Large debts, monetary policies not working well, politically fragmented governments, borrowing more and printing money to fund it, growing gaps between people in terms of wealth and values, and a growing challenger world power. That doesn't guarantee that change is like imminent. It's certainly a much higher likelihood than it has been for many decades. Good leadership could delay that outcome, or could at least steer the country towards the least damaging version of the outcome, peaceful revolution, not violent, for instance. And there are novel factors shaping the world that Dalio doesn't really deal with, like the trend towards stabilising and declining population and automation, the effects of which we don't entirely yet know how it's going to play out. But the current state looks so similar in fundamentals to what came before, it would be a brave betting man not to think that we should expect the same outcomes to play out. It comes down, Dalio says, to the three big cycles, added to two other big forces. The cycles are first, that cycle of good and bad finances, the capital market cycle. Second, the cycle of internal order and disorder, which comes down to the degree of cooperation or fighting over wealth and power, largely caused by wealth and values gaps. And third, the cycle of external order and disorder, the competitiveness between great nations in fighting for wealth and power. Add to those three two more factors. One, the pace of innovation to solve problems and make improvements, and two, acts of nature of most historical importance, droughts, floods and diseases. In total, Dalio identifies 18 determinants that make a difference, including various others such as geology, geography, the rule of law, which is key, infrastructure and various others. His research analyses numerous of the major countries to see how well they're currently faring against these various measures. And you can add to those certain dynamics that are crucially important, but can't have numbers put onto them. So, for instance, where do people see their self-interest? Is it in their country or in themselves as individuals? How strong is people's desire to gain wealth and power from their current state? Are they hungry for it or are they not? Dalio notes, by the way, that people who live in cultures and countries that don't seek to gain and wield world power can sometimes be all the more contented for it. I mean, it depends on certain situational factors that by definition may not be in their control, such as the degree of interference they get from the great powers. But it's worth bearing in mind, having a good life isn't necessarily dependent on your country's status as a great power. Other dynamics, whether the country learns from history or not, how quickly decisions get made, whether the culture is productive or unproductive, the degree of partisanship and division. The most important on historical evidence is the way that people are with themselves and with others, whether they hold themselves to high standards of behaviour, whether they're self-disciplined, whether they're civil with others in order to be productive members of their societies. Add to that the qualities of flexibility and resilience, the ability to adapt to good and bad things. Dalio says this: character, common sense, creativity and consideration in most people make for a productive society. All of those things are improved through quality education, a culture of hard work and cooperation, which shouldn't be a surprise. In addition to that, the key to a successful country in the long run is financial, very basic. It has to earn as much or more than what it spends. A country that's not a great power but earns and spends modestly is going to be more sustainably successful than those that earn and spend a lot more and run deficits. Inevitably, the deficits grow once the dynamic is set, and eventually that will result in a degree of difficulty and misery. So-called modern monetary theory be damned, the basic rules for a good individual life do ultimately hold true for countries as well, if history is a good judge. You would think that, given the clarity of history, people wouldn't go around making the same mistakes over and over again. But most people don't learn from history. Dalio argues that if you don't understand how the Roaring Twenties led to a debt bubble and a big wealth gap, how the bursting of that bubble led to the 1930 to 33 Great Depression, and how the Depression led to conflicts over wealth all over the world, you won't understand why Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. You won't understand why soon after becoming president he announced a new plan where the central government and the Federal Reserve provided a lot of money and credit, similar to what's happening today in response to the pandemic, and why that led to World War II, and why the New World Order was created in the way that it was in 1945. All of those things were driven by underlying mechanics. Understanding them helps better to understand what's happening now and have a sense of where it's likely to lead in the future. Some do it better, and Dalio notes that the Chinese are significantly better than most in the fact that they're learning from history. One reason perhaps why it's still a factor in China that they feel burning resentment of the century of humiliation, something that is a driver for modern day ambition. And it's not just learning from the past, but being open to global thinking in the present. China endured that century of humiliation as a consequence of its leaders deciding it was so far ahead of everyone else. It had nothing to learn from anyone, and so it would shut itself off into isolation. Well, learning about the best the world has to offer helps you to reach your own potential and keeps you sharp. Clearly a lesson China has learned, for now anyway. So look, there are many other factors Dalio goes through, all of which make sense and are relatively intuitive. The importance of all of this is what insight it shines on where we are today and where things are therefore likely to go. When you understand it's part of this sort of cycle, it should be possible to look at the changes without judgment. The details of who said what and who did what to whom, they're not as important as people think. If you can step back and understand the changing forces that are going on, it can inform the best strategy of what to do next. So Dalio observes that over the last few years, the world has been moving away from becoming more globalist towards being more nationalist, and you may think that's a morally good thing. You may, on the other hand, think that it's a morally terrible thing. Dalio does neither. He simply looks at the phenomenon, witnesses it as a natural consequence to the chain of causes which will create other consequences of its own which are predictable. So this is his description of what's happening in the US. The United States appears to be losing its cohesion as people's views of how they should be with each other are becoming more divergent. These divergences are leading people to migrate to the states that align with their preferences, causing those states to be more relevant individually than as parts of a unified whole. History and logic show us that these changes in domestic and international orders are typically accompanied by conflicts because there are lots of disagreement about how they should work, e.g. what states' rights are relative to national rights. Because most people haven't seen such changes before, they fail to recognise them for what they are. And this is why the cycles repeat. People just follow the incentives that are in front of them. So yes, when credit cycles reach their limit, it is the logical and classic response of governments and their central banks to create a lot of debt and print money. You can do this well if you create debt to spend on investment that will deliver a return high enough to pay off the debt and deliver a surplus. By and large, that's not what they do. Generally, it goes into goods and services and other activity to keep the economy moving in the short term. That was done during the 2008 debt crisis when interest rates couldn't be lowered because they'd already hit zero, and it's happened in an even bigger way as a response to COVID. Dalio looks at all of that and concludes this principle for all of us. History has shown that we shouldn't rely on governments to protect us financially. On the contrary, we should expect most governments to abuse their privileged positions as the creators and users of money and credit for the same reasons that you might commit those abuses if you were in their shoes. Throughout history, he says, rulers have opted to run up debts that won't come due until their term of office has long since expired. What does this mean for the future? Does it mean that the die is cast and there's nothing we can do about it? Well, sort of yes and sort of no. Certain aspects seem built in. The decline of the nations that have massively overloaded themselves with debt are in the swing of printing more and more money to cope. That seems like something that you could slow down but will only be resolved by the usual process of conflict coming to a head so that the slate can be wiped clean. The form of that conflict doesn't necessarily turn to violence. Arguably in the UK, it started with Brexit. While it probably still has some way to run, it seems more likely that here it will be resolved, as it was in 1945, through change of a more ordered kind. Let's hope so. In the US, the potential for violence is obviously more right there in front of people. A number have started openly discussing whether civil war is on the cards. A minority on both sides might even welcome that. Dalio puts the possibility of civil war at 30%, which, is not 70%, but obviously it's a lot higher than you would want it to be. The key indicator, he says, will be when people abandon the rule of law and purely promote their side's advantage. All internal orders have rules about how decisions are made and how power is gained and shared. Because one can usually see how well these governance rules are respected or ignored, it's pretty easy to see when an internal order is being threatened by an emerging civil war. For example, when close elections are adjudicated and the loser respects the decisions, it is clear that the order is respected. When power is fought over and grabbed, that clearly signals the significant risk of a revolutionary change with all its attendant disorder. Well, that rings a few bells. If Trump runs in 2024, there would be strong contingents on both sides that would be inclined to dismiss the result if it went against them. You can see it in the Democrats' rhetoric about Republican election laws at state level, the reality of which don't remotely match the apocalyptic descriptions accorded to them by their opponents. And of course, we could take it as read that Trump wouldn't accept defeat as legitimate. So whether the rule of law survives 2024 is by no means a foregone conclusion. But whether it goes to violence or not, a period of hardship and conflict is well overdue in the modern age. And all the signs are now there. Dalio offers this note of hope for individuals. While these revolution/war periods typically lead to a lot of human suffering, we should never, especially in the worst of times, lose sight of the fact that one can navigate them well, and that humanity's power to adapt and quickly get to new and higher levels of well-being is much greater than all the bad stuff that can be thrown at us. We have more sophistication and technology now and understanding than we had at any point in the past when such conflicts took place, and that's got to help. And the emerging rival, China, has some constraints of its own that may interrupt what would historically have been an apparently inevitable rise, not least its soon-to-be declining population, plus the fact that its national sense of unity and purpose is mostly held together at the moment by keeping in a system of censorship. Which is a vulnerability, because the more you dominate the world, the harder it is to shield yourself from it. And another positive note for the US, the reserve currency status of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, may be growing, but it is still at a very early stage. It's hard to see the dollar losing its status for a significant period of time in the absence of credible alternatives. The number 2 reserve currency, the euro, is declining, not growing. So we're not going to be wanting to do without the dollars just yet. That should give you time to take some corrective action, you might think. But you'd have to start by ending the practice of spending a lot more money than you're actually getting in. Don't quite see how that's going to happen just yet. How could we ultimately reduce the negative impact of all of these cycles? How can we make it better? Dalio's argument is that this requires an evolution of capitalism. I've had exposure to all kinds of economic systems all over the world and have seen why the ability to make money, save it and put it into capital is an effective motivator of people and allocator of resources that raises people's living standards. But capitalism is also a source of wealth and opportunity gaps that are unfair, can be counterproductive, are highly cyclical and can be destabilizing. In my opinion, the greatest challenge for policymakers is to engineer a capitalist economic system that raises productivity and living standards without worsening inequities and instabilities. If that capitalist economic system could be environmentally sustainable as well, that would also be fine. Now look, there's lots more in Dalio's book, and I strongly recommend as giving useful context to the current state of the world. And by the way, I did a video recently looking at one aspect of the cycle of decline, the rise of safetyism in our society, and why it has undermined us in ways that we could never have expected. In retrospect, it is wholly in line with Dalio's reasoning in his book. If you've made it this far, you might want to watch that video next.